Many of the reporters and journalists we know and love today cut their teeth in local radio. Keep your eyes peeled for a young Kate Adie, among others, now on BBC4, as Nation on Film brings together archive footage, audio and visual, to celebrate 40 years in local radio.
That's Philip Marsden talking about budgies. In fact, he's talking about Radio Durham's Talking Budgie competition. But before we continue with All About Animals today, I've just had a news flash. News as it happens on Radio Durham.
1, 2.
It may not look like a revolution, but 40 years ago, that's exactly what it was. It was an experiment in a new kind of broadcasting. It had just 2 years to succeed, but there were powerful enemies who wanted it to fail. Here on film, the story of how BBC local radio was born and struggled to survive.
Hello BBC, this is Frank Gillard here, recording just outside Tilly.
It all began with Frank Gillard. He'd made his name as a war reporter. By the 1960s, he was head of BBC Radio, and he had a big idea: to bring local radio to Britain. For some stars of the future, it was a first step into the business.
I rang them up one day and I said, look, I'm kind of vaguely interested in this, I know nothing about it, would you be interested in me doing anything or having a look round at least? And they said, oh, yes, come on down.
At one point they looked a bit puzzled about me because I was sort of female and red brick. I wasn't quite the BBC sort. And they said, what would you be prepared to do? And I said, anything. I wanted the job. And they wrote that down, apparently, and it's still on the form.
Another musical selection on this morning's merry-go-round.
Gillard got his idea from America, the home of commercial broadcasting, and the land where local radio was thriving.
And so, with the clock standing at nearly midnight, we bring to a close another day of broadcasting for Cowboy Radio.
But Gillard wanted a very British kind of local station.
Good morning. This is Radio London, your local BBC station. And here is Michael Payne with the local news.
That's the main talking point on the trains this morning as the rush hour crowds stream in.
His tactics were carefully planned. He ran local radio experiments in the early 1960s and filmed them to generate publicity as he tried to win over politicians and the BBC itself.
Outside, in London itself, reporters are on the spot for the latest news, sometimes using radio cars to broadcast live reports into the news bulletins.
This is Angus McDermott calling BBC Radio London.
He knew that if he was going to win any favour at all with local politicians or indeed national ones, he had to have some good evidence. So he set up these experiments, closed circuit, no broadcasting, in different places.
This is your local BBC station serving Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole.
And the edited highlights he used as his evidence to appear in front of steering committees in Parliament and his fellow men in the BBC and women who were perhaps a bit sceptical about this local radio idea. But Frank was the master craftsman at knowing how to win favour with people.
Gillard wanted stations right across the country, close to their audience, but that wouldn't be easy. They filmed their first attempts to talk to listeners.
Excuse me, do you go to the youth clubs in this area? There are plenty of them, but not many young people do seem to go.
No, I don't. I steer clear of them.
Well, why?
Well, they're usually full of hooligans and teddy boys, and I prefer to look for other entertainment elsewhere.
They're just not your type?
No, definitely not.
Gillard and his young reporters had two big problems. Would it be any good? And who'd pay for it?
This is Ray Colley calling BBC Radio London.
The bill was £50,000 a year to run a radio station. But the real trump card that Frank played was persuading government, this is a Labour government with Harold Wilson, to have an experiment, a 2-year experiment, but it wouldn't come from the licence fee. It would be from the local authorities themselves, and anybody else who would put their hand in the pocket.
For the BBC, it was all quite shocking. 8 local authorities offered to pay for the new stations.
At the time, it all seems like part of a deliberate plan. As it turned out, the BBC couldn't afford it, but felt it necessary to seize the territory and get established.
In 1967, these few cities and towns were in the front line of a broadcasting battle. But some of Gillard's young army didn't have much idea of what they were letting themselves in for.
I hadn't a clue what we were going to do. I just needed the job, and I thought that radio and broadcasting looked fascinating.
I was in the world of great, dramatic and glamorous world of insurance. And I'd been in it for several years, and I was getting by and doing very well in the business and getting promotions and all that sort of stuff, and passing all the exams. And I thought, well, if I've got to do this for the rest of my life, so be it. I'll at least make a success out of it. But when local radio turned up, I suddenly got this dreadful bug. I love this. So extraordinary, I gave up my career and took up my hobby. And it's been my hobby ever since.
In Brighton in 1967, a local filmmaker recorded the arrival of this new kind of broadcasting. For a young Des Lynam, it was the BBC, but not as we'd known it.
You felt as though you weren't part of that great organisation, really. I remember it was chaotic, or it seemed to be chaotic, with guys flashing around. You felt as though you were a little offshoot, and they were sort of throwing you out there, get on with it. And the facilities were reasonably limited, and the funding was very limited.
Brighton and the new stations had another problem. They'd be broadcasting on VHF, FM, and hardly anybody had the right radios. But change was in the air. Pirate broadcasters played pop from boats. The 60s were starting to swing. Could local radio succeed? And was Auntie BBC the best person to provide it?
We hadn't had anything like this before. The only commercial model was either Radio Éireann or Radio Luxembourg. There'd been the Pirates, but this was nothing like the Pirates. This was somewhere between the very old Home Service and something sort of trying to talk in a local voice.
The studios are now ready. The workmen are gone. Rehearsals begin in earnest.
It was a rush to get on air. Captured on amateur footage, Radio Brighton was looking like a radio station.
This is Roger Matthews. Welcome to Radio Leicester.
But Radio Leicester was the first to open, going on air on November the 8th, 1967.
And what a day. We've had the Postmaster General to open the station, the Lord Mayor of Leicester's had a say, and we've got more visitors in the studio this afternoon. During the next...
Broadcasting history was being made. For a young journalist filmed in the studio that morning, it was a day to remember.
There I was, a nervous young man at the controls of the radio station that was the first to go on the air in the country.
Well, I'll flash right round to my next request, which is from Julie Howard of 18 Foss Road, North Leicester.
We don't know who was listening, but for a quarter of an hour we read out local news and traffic information and stuff like that. And then we went into The World at One on BBC Radio 4 and immediately heard ourselves coming back again because it was big, major national news.
Britain's first experimental local radio station, Radio Leicester, went on the air about a quarter of an hour ago. The station's first news bulletin told of a telephone call saying a bomb was timed to go off in the station at 1 o'clock, but the station is in fact still on the air.
Soon, 8 stations were broadcasting, with a mix of news, sport and local features. But this was an experiment, and it showed.
I would be embarrassed to play back some of those programs today, because we were learning all the time. And half the staff had never been anywhere near a radio station in their lives.